Now that we're working on practicing techniques before we start the pattern, the other thing I would recommend practicing is your top stitching, and then just decide if you want to freehand your double rows of top stitching or use a twin needle. So you can try a couple different techniques. I have this same sample fabric. I have it folded so that it is double thickness, and I'm going to just practice my top stitching along this folded edge. So I can use my presser foot to guide my lines, and I can see how straight I can get them. I can also use the design tape and run a row that is just about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and I can use that the same as I was showing on the edge stitch foot. It extends out in front, so we'll stitch just along that line and then remove it to stitch the second line. So here I am back at the machine, and this is a technique if you have just a standard presser foot. I have the needle placed at the center point for my stitching. I'm going to run this right underneath here so that my center stitching line, this mark in the middle of my presser foot, is just to the right of my tape. And then I can just go ahead and stitch right down using the tape to guide from the front side as I sew. So there you can see we have a very consistent stitch line. So if I pull this tape off, my stitch line is straight, and then if I wanted to do a second row just next to that, I would move this over again about 1/8 of an inch, and then I would come down and stitch my second row of stitching. So I have the tape placed, it's 1/8 of an inch over, and then I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to lower my presser foot so that this center line is just to the right of my tape, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch my second row. And there you can see I have a stitch line that goes right along that piece of tape, and if I remove the tape, you can see we have a very consistent straight stitch line. So I have a double row of stitches that looks pretty straight. So this is a good alternative if you don't have a twin needle and you're just using a standard presser foot to create consistent straight stitch lines. And one last thing I would recommend practicing before you start your actual jacket or before you sew the buttonholes on your jacket are the actual buttonholes. So look at your machine, see the parts that you have. If you want to sew this by machine with a buttonhole foot, I would just recommend using these same scraps. I have this folded under. I have 3/8 inch casing right here, basically stitched down to mimic that front placket, and then I just want to see if I can easily and consistently stitch buttonholes like this with my machine. If I can't do it with my buttonhole foot, then I will simply draw little lines and do this manually by hand with a satin stitch, and then scoot over and then a satin stitch to create this look of the buttonhole. So here I am at my machine. I have the buttonhole foot installed, and you can see this little marker right here is going to create the depth of my button, so it's not very long from start to finish. My buttonhole starts at the back, stitches forward, across, and back. So I'm going to put each one of these markings underneath here, lining this up with the back side and the center. So I will lower that foot down right on top of the center of the line and the very end point where I would like for it to start. Then I'm going to see if this fits in this distance. So that is my first buttonhole, It's a pretty good size. It's probably a little bit too big. If I'm actually trying to get it to fit in between these lines, I could adjust this down a tiny bit to be a little bit shorter, but it's actually okay as is because it's going right on the lines. So I'm just going to then go in and slide my next one right into the next line of the buttonhole, and I'm lining that up right on the back side, right on the center. And there is the second buttonhole. So on this machine, this works really well. I can get a tiny little 3/8 inch wide buttonhole inside this placket on this jacket. So I would just practice this a few times, and then I would go ahead and do it on the actual garment. Now, say you don't have the buttonhole foot attachment, or you're just really not confident enough to sew a buttonhole right up at this edge on this front placket. I totally understand that. It's the worst to feel like you've wrecked the garment at the very end at that final stage. So if you're not comfortable doing that with these tiny little buttonholes, or you can't get your machine to sew buttonholes that small, you can do it freehand style. So I have my machine set at a zigzag stitch, and I have the stitch length pushed down pretty low so that I can sew a tiny little zigzag really close together as it moves forward. So I'm just going to have to eyeball this. I have this little marked line is going to be right at the center. And I'm going to start at the back, and I'm going to work my way forward to this front line. Then I'm just going to scoot this over, and I'm going to put my reverse button down the whole entire time. I'm going to go down and sew back right next to the one that I did. And then I'm going to come back over and go back and forth a little bit. And then I'm going to pull this out. Now you can see my first row forward worked better than my back row. So maybe the better technique for right now would just be to sew 2 rows forward and then do a larger zigzag at both ends. So we're going to try that now, one line over. So that would be the first side of my buttonhole. And then now I'm going to push that so that that stitching line is way over on this side. And I'm going to sew up on the right side of that. So now I have 2 rows for the edges of my buttonhole, and then I'm just going to make my zigzag much wider, and then I'm going to set that right at the end and zigzag from both lines across. But I'm going to set my stitch length all the way down to 0 so that I sew in one place. The fabric does not slide forward or backward. So that is creating the end of the button. And then I'm going to do that same thing up at this very center front edge. And there you can see we have a freehand style buttonhole sewn very similar to this. So you can play around with this technique and really figure out the placement that will work the best for the size button. This one is a little bit long. I was a little bit too far back when I sewed that second wider zigzag to close the end of my buttonhole. So as I'm experimenting, I would make sure that I did that a little bit closer forward to be inside my 2 stitching lines. So for part 1, you have quite a few things to practice. Let's make sure we practice the flat felled seam, Practice your top stitching, the double row top stitching as well as just close to the edge top stitching, and then go through and practice sewing your buttonholes smaller than 3/8 of an inch in length to get really comfortable with the style that you're going to want to use on the pattern once we move forward with the sew along and the full tutorial.